Okay, so I'm going to talk about slave resistance, and what happened is that so slaves know the situation. There's a lot of communication. They're aware of what's going on. They're aware that they're under surveillance. They're human beings, right? They're talking to each other to the extent that they can, and passing information to each other to the extent that they can. And so what we have in terms of resistance, so very, very few instances of violent revolt of slaves in Texas. And so, how did slaves resist this horrible situation that they found themselves in? Well, one of the most important ways was running away. Slaves would run away, and I have an ad up here that I'll post it. Uh, Mary, she's a slave named Mary, and this was kind of unusual. Most runaways were actually male, but in this case, Mary, she's aged 26 to 36, um, having lost almost all her front teeth. She speaks French and English, which means she's probably from Louisiana. In fact, it says Bayou. So, Louisiana still had, there were a lot of folks that spoke French and English at this time. She has a small child, 6 months old, which she must have carried with her. And she is very intimate with a Negro named William. And I don't think it's too much to guess that William is the father of her child. And both of them for a long time have had relations with this thing. It says Negro fishermen on the bayou. So they're offering $20 for the return of Mary. So one of the things that historians, and you're going to be looking at this in a couple of weeks, historians have actually uncovered hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of runaway slave ads where owners are putting ads in papers for runaway slaves. So this was probably the single most common form of resistance against slavery. I read an ad where a woman ran away with her child, probably to try to reunite with her husband. But in I would say most runaways were male, but you did have some women running away too. Now, why would Mary want to run away? Note that she doesn't have a last name because she hasn't been given a last name. Often after emancipation, you'll see this in Tomlinson Hill, slaves would take on the last name of their owner just for convenience. Wasn't really a sign of love. It was just the most convenient thing. So she doesn't have a last name, which was very, very common. It was usually just the first name. And the key point I want to make here is that the Texas exception, that slaves in Texas went south. Uh, Texas was the only place where slaves went south instead of north. If you could get to Mexico, you were free. Mexico refused to extradite slaves. In fact, the Constitution, the Mexican Constitution of 1857, one of the very, very first uh, 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 parts of the Mexican Constitution, articles of the Mexican Constitution, talks about how slavery doesn't exist in Mexico, and that anyone who's on Mexican soil is free. So Mexico refused to extradite runaway slaves that went into Mexico from Texas. And I have to say, Mexico almost never gets any credit for ending slavery over 30 years before the United States and ending it without a drop of blood being shed. But I spent a couple of weeks talking about that in the context of that in the Texas Revolution. But hey, let's give a little shout out to Mexico. Okay, Mexico always seems to be getting criticized, but this is one area that Mexico could be proud of, and in fact, Mexicans were very proud that slavery didn't exist in Mexico, and Mexicans used the lack of slavery to define themselves against the United States and to argue that they were actually a more moral nation than the United States during this period. Now, When slaves ran away, not everybody could make it to Mexico. It's a long way to the Rio Grande. Slaveholders were very, very cautious. They very, very seldom would take their slaves to the border region, because they knew if a slave got away, if they could get across the Rio Grande, which was not that hard to do, they would be freed. So most masters kept slaves away from the border. We think, although we're not sure, that by 1850, maybe as many as 3,000 slaves escaped to Mexico. That's a very controversial figure. Honestly, that seems a little high to me, just because the journey was so tough to Mexico and there weren't that many roads. But it is possible. And we were thinking that by 1860, historians that have looked into this, I haven't, there might have been as many as 4,000 slaves that escaped into Mexico. I hope so, anyway. Most of these runaways were men. Most were between the ages of 20 and 40, because the journey, it was just so tough to get to Mexico from East Texas. Even today, it's a long drive. And Texans were very angry at Mexico because Mexico wouldn't extradite slaves, wouldn't send slaves back. And they tried to convince the US government to negotiate with Mexico for an extradition treaty, but Mexico just wouldn't have anything to do with that. One of the things that I need to stress is that if you ran away, I would say the majority of runaways actually were probably recaptured. Remember, they're under close surveillance. There's slave patrols. Any African American walking on a public road is liable for search by any whites. So many runaways were recaptured. But even if you ran away just for a couple of months, that could really put a dent into the plans of the planner or your owner, especially if you ran away, for instance, during the harvesting season. Now, slavery really carried risks too, right? A large number of slaves that ran away were captured, some within a couple of weeks, some were within a couple of months, others escaped altogether. But of course, the big issue was whipping, the whippings of slaves, the punishment of slaves once you were captured. So it was risky, but it was by far the most common form of resistance for slaves to run away. Even if you didn't get completely away, you could really mess up your master's plans. Now, slaveholders, as I said before, were super paranoid that there were going to be slave revolts like the Nat Turner Rebellion, really, in the 1830s in Virginia, which killed about 60 whites were killed in this revolt. And so they're very paranoid about slave revolts. They're keeping a very close eye on slaves. And they come to believe that the Tejanos in Texas are sympathetic to slaves, that there's an underground railroad of Tejanos that will assist slaves get to Mexico. And the closer historians look at that, the closer that there's a consensus that's kind of gathering that this actually could be correct, that there might have been an underground railroad of Tejanos assisting slaves get to Mexico. But again, it would have not been that easy. Surveillance was very tight. There weren't that many roads, but there might have been some assistance. Certainly, whites did believe that Tejanos were involved in helping slaves escape. So Tejanos were driven out of places like Austin. They were completely driven out of places like Austin. They were because they weren't trusted. They weren't seen as being fanatical enough about slavery. And by this point, very few Tejanos, just a handful, owned slaves. And there might have been some Tejano slave alliances. We know near the border, there were some marriages between Tejanos and ex-slaves. So you certainly didn't have the intense racism among Tejanos and African Americans that you did among whites and African Americans. And that made whites very, very suspicious. Other forms of resistance, slave families. There were no legal rights for slaves to get married, but slaves did. They would adopt the African custom of jumping the broom or jumping the stick that showed that you were a couple. Now, masters on the whole were okay with slave families because slave families tended to promote the birth of slave children. As I said before, one of the evils of slavery is that slave children were owned by the master. It didn't matter who your father was. If you were born of a slave mother, you were a slave. That was a law. That's one of the most insidious things about slavery. So families were a contradiction when it came to slavery. It's family, of course, offered solace to slaves. The harsh regime of slavery. Um, but on the other hand, slaves, men and women and children, parents, they knew that their children, there was a good chance that their children would be forcibly separated from them, that they would be taken and sold. The husbands were often taken from their wives. If you were a slave child, you had over a 50% chance of being taken from your parents and sold. Can you imagine a mother of a slave, what that would be like, knowing that your child could be taken from you at any time? And this is one of the things, folks will, mostly white folks will say, well, some slaveholders were nice, blah, blah. The thing is, you could have the nicest slaveholder in the world, but let's say that slaveholder is bankrupt and needs assets. Well, and what are the assets that that person has that are the most valuable? In many cases, it's slaves. And so even the nicest slaveholder in the world, if they become bankrupt, they would sell their slaves. Or if the nice slaveholder died, right? Then their slaves might be up for sale. So it didn't matter if they were individually nice slaveholders. I mean, it was better for the slaves that were owned by humane slaveholders, but they were enmeshed in a system that if anything happened to the slaveholder, you would be thrown into the maw of a system that might easily cause separation of children from families, husbands from wives. Now, religion was another source of strength for slaves. Slaves were very, very religious. Christianity was by far the most dominant form of religion among slaves. Um, Slaves would look to Moses, of course, and the Israelites as a form of hope, of freedom. So religion offers solace. Also, slave music offered solace. Slaves sang to set the pace of work and as a means of communication. I talked about the drinking gourd in states outside of Texas. By singing, slaves could pass along information to each other. And a master could look at slaves and see the slaves singing. And as one slave wrote, we hummed our religious songs in the field while we were working. It was our way of praying for freedom, but the white folks didn't know it. So sometimes when the slaves were singing, they were passing on information about where to escape, how to escape, where a runaway might be hiding, so his wife would know that she was safe. So what you have is you have communication among slaves themselves. So, and the last form of resistance I'll talk about is just what we call everyday forms of resistance. Slaves would try to set their own pace of work instead of working as hard as the overseer wanted them to work. Slave women in the household might break a favorite dish, for instance. A slave in the field might let a cow go or kill a cow. They might break equipment. Again, the punishment for this could well be whipping. So, but nonetheless, slaves had their ways of resisting the oppression that they lived in. But I just want to end here. It's very, very important that we see that slaves fought the condition that they were in, that they weren't passive victims to this atrocity that they were born into. But at the same time, their resistance came pretty much on the margins because of the overwhelming violence and surveillance that slaves were under. There was only so much that slaves could do, but thankfully, and we understand more and more, that whenever slaves saw a chance to resist, they took it.